Sarah Martinez had been working at Precision Point Shooting Range for exactly 8 months and 12 days when her life changed forever. She knew the exact count because she had been marking each day on her phone calendar, counting down to when she could finally afford to quit and go back to college. The job wasn't glamorous, is cleaning lanes, resetting targets, and dealing with customers who thought they knew everything about firearms, but it paid enough to keep her small apartment and put food on the table while she saved for tuition. The morning started like any other. Sarah arrived at 6:30, 30 minutes before the range opened, and began her routine. She checked the ventilation systems, tested the target retrieval mechanisms, and made sure each shooting lane was spotless. The familiar smell of gun oil and cleaning solvent had become oddly comforting over the months. It reminded her of her grandfather's garage, where he used to maintain his old hunting rifles and tell her stories about his time in the Korean War. By 7:15, the first customers began trickling in. The morning crowd was predictable, mostly law enforcement officers getting in their required practice time before their shifts, a few dedicated sport shooters, and occasionally someone preparing for a hunting trip. Sarah knew most of them by sight if not by name. There was Detective Rodriguez, who always arrived precisely at 7:20, Officer Chin, who brought his daughter every other Saturday, and Mr. Thompson, who was teaching his wife to shoot after a break-in in their neighborhood. Today felt different, though. Sarah couldn't pinpoint exactly why, but there was an energy in the air that made her more alert than usual. Maybe it was the weather. Storm clouds had been building since dawn, and the atmospheric pressure seemed to make everything feel charged with electricity. Or maybe it was just her imagination, the result of staying up too late studying for her online psychology classes. Around 10:30, she noticed a new face. A man in his early 30s with the kind of posture that immediately marked him as military, even though he was wearing civilian clothes. He moved with a precise, economical grace that Sarah had learned to recognize in veterans who frequented the range. His shoulders were broad, his dark hair was cut in a regulation fade that was trying to grow out, and his eyes constantly scanned the environment in a way that seemed automatic rather than conscious. He approached the counter where Sarah was organizing ammunition inventory sheets. Up close, she could see small scars on his hands and a thin line across his left temple that spoke of experiences she couldn't imagine. When he spoke, his voice was quiet but carried an authority that made her pay attention immediately. "I'd like Lane 7 for 2 hours, he said, placing a military ID and range credentials on the counter. The name read Master Chief Petty Officer James Morrison, and the unit designation made Sarah's eyes widen slightly. Navy SEALs didn't come to civilian ranges very often. "Of course, Master Chief," Sarah replied, processing his paperwork with extra care. She had served enough military personnel to know that respect for rank was important, even in civilian settings. "Will you need target frames or are you bringing your own?" "I'll take a variety pack," Morrison said, his eyes already drifting toward the lanes. "And I'll need the lane clear for the full 2 hours. No interruptions unless there's an emergency." Sarah nodded and prepared his lane, making sure the target system was functioning perfectly and that the neighboring lanes would remain available so he wouldn't be disturbed by other shooters. As she worked, she found herself stealing glances at Morrison. He was methodically unpacking a custom rifle case, and every movement was deliberate and purposeful. The weapon he assembled was unlike anything she had seen customers bring in before, a precision rifle that probably cost more than her annual salary. For the next hour and a half, the range operated with its usual rhythm. Customers came and went, Sarah reset targets and cleaned lanes, and Morrison worked with mechanical precision in Lane 7. Occasionally she would hear the distinctive crack of his rifle, always in controlled, measured sequences. Unlike many customers who seemed to be trying to prove something with rapid fire or dramatic flourishes, Morrison's shooting was clinical and methodical. It was approaching noon when Sarah noticed the change. Morrison had stopped shooting, but he hadn't begun packing his equipment. Instead, he was standing motionless at his shooting station, staring downrange at targets he hadn't changed in 45 minutes. His rifle was still assembled on the bench in front of him, but his hands were hanging loose at his sides. Sarah watched discreetly while she worked. Something was wrong. In 8 months of working at the range, she had learned to read the body language of shooters. This wasn't someone taking a break or contemplating their next shot pattern. This was someone who seemed to be somewhere else entirely, despite his physical presence in the lane. She finished organizing the ammunition storage and decided to check on him. It was part of her job to ensure customer safety, and something about Morrison's stillness was triggering alarm bells in her mind. As she approached lane 7, she could see that his breathing had changed. Instead of the steady rhythm she had observed throughout his shooting session, his chest was rising and falling in quick, shallow movements. "Master Chief Morrison," she called softly from behind the shooting station.
"Is everything all right?" He didn't respond immediately.
When he finally turned to look at her, Sarah was startled by the expression in his eyes. The controlled, alert demeanor she had observed earlier was gone, replaced by something that looked like confusion mixed with barely contained panic. His hands were trembling slightly, and a thin sheen of sweat had appeared on his forehead despite the cool temperature in the range.
Morrison started to speak, then stopped. He looked down at his hands as if he didn't recognize them, then back at Sarah. "I think I need to. I should probably."
He trailed off again, and Sarah realized she was witnessing something she had read about in her psychology textbooks but never seen in person. The clinical term was dissociation, but the human reality was a decorated combat veteran whose mind was temporarily disconnected from his present reality. Sarah had no training in dealing with psychological crises, but her instincts told her that Morrison was fighting an internal battle that had nothing to do with the shooting range or his physical surroundings. She glanced around quickly to make sure no other customers were nearby, then stepped closer to the shooting station. "Master Chief," she said, keeping her voice calm and steady. "You're at precision point range.
It's Tuesday, about noon. You've been shooting for about an hour and a half.
You're safe." Morrison's eyes focused on her more clearly at the sound of her voice. He took a deep breath and nodded slowly, but his hands were still shaking. He looked down at the rifle on the bench in front of him, and Sarah saw something that looked like fear cross his face.
"I can't," he said quietly. "I don't think I should."
Without finishing the sentence, Morrison stepped back from the shooting bench. In one fluid motion, he picked up his custom rifle and extended it toward Sarah. The weapon was worth thousands of dollars and was probably more precise than anything the range owned, but he was offering it to her as if it were a tool he no longer trusted himself to hold. "Would you mind taking this?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper.
"I think I need to step away for a minute."
Sarah found herself holding a piece of military-grade precision equipment that she had no business touching, watching as a Navy SEAL walked slowly toward the exit of the shooting lane with his head down and his shoulders curved inward. The transformation from confident warrior to vulnerable human being had happened so quickly that she was still processing what she had witnessed. As Morrison disappeared around the corner toward the range's rest area, Sarah stood alone in lane 7, holding his rifle and trying to understand what had just happened. The weight of the weapon in her hands felt symbolic of something much larger than firearms or target practice. She was holding the trust of someone who had just experienced something that had shaken him to his core. Looking down the range at the targets Morrison had been shooting, Sarah noticed something she hadn't seen from a distance.
The paper targets weren't random practice sheets.
They were human silhouettes, and every shot had been placed with surgical precision in what would be fatal zones. But more disturbing was the pattern she could now see clearly. Morrison hadn't just been practicing his marksmanship. The bullet holes formed a constellation that looked almost like a map, as if he had been trying to navigate through memories that existed only in his mind. Sarah realized that she was looking at the evidence of a man who had been reliving something terrible while believing he was simply maintaining his shooting skills. The rifle in her hands wasn't just a tool for target practice, it was connected to experiences and training that had shaped Morrison into someone capable of incredible precision and unimaginable trauma. Standing alone in the shooting lane, surrounded by the smell of gunpowder and the distant sound of other customers practicing their marksmanship, Sarah Martinez understood that her ordinary Tuesday had just become something extraordinary. She was holding more than a weapon, she was holding a moment of trust from someone who had forgotten, temporarily, how to trust himself. The question now was what she was going to do about it. Sarah stood in lane 7 for what felt like an eternity but was probably only 3 minutes, Morrison's rifle cradled carefully in her arms like she was holding someone's sleeping child. The weight of it was substantial, not just the physical 10 pounds of precision-engineered metal and composite materials, but the emotional weight of being trusted with something that obviously meant everything to a man who was currently fighting demons she couldn't see. She had no protocol for this situation. The range safety manual covered misfires, equipment malfunctions, and medical emergencies, but nothing about what to do when a decorated Navy SEAL hands you his weapon and walks away because his mind has temporarily betrayed him. Sarah's 8 months of experience had taught her about trigger discipline, proper ventilation, and how to deal with customers who tried to bring prohibited ammunition, but nothing had prepared her for this moment of raw human vulnerability. Through the soundproof glass that separated the shooting lanes from the rest area, Sarah could see Morrison sitting on one of the benches with his head in his hands. His shoulders were rising and falling in a rhythm that suggested he was practicing some kind of breathing exercise. Even from a distance, she could see the tension in his posture, the way his entire body seemed to be fighting against invisible forces.
Sarah made a decision.
She carefully engaged the safety on Morrison's rifle, though she suspected he had already done so before handing it to her. She placed the weapon in the secure storage cabinet behind the counter, locked it, and pocketed the key. Then, she grabbed a bottle of water from the staff refrigerator and walked toward the rest area. Morrison looked up as she approached, and Sarah was relieved to see that some of the confusion had cleared from his eyes. The trembling in his hands had mostly stopped, though she could still see the aftermath of whatever internal storm he had just weathered. When he saw her, he attempted a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I'm sorry about that," he said, his voice steadier than it had been in the shooting lane.
"I don't usually, that doesn't normally happen."
Sarah sat down on the bench across from him and offered him the water bottle. "You don't need to apologize for anything, Master Chief. I've got your rifle secured, and your lane is still reserved for another 20 minutes if you want to finish your session." Morrison accepted the water but didn't open it immediately. Instead, he studied Sarah's face as if he were trying to determine whether she was judging him for what had happened. Whatever he saw there seemed to satisfy him, because some of the tension in his shoulders relaxed.
"How much do you know about PTSD?" he asked suddenly.
The directness of the question caught Sarah off guard, but she appreciated his honesty. "I'm taking psychology classes online," she said.
"I know the basics, but I've never seen it happen in real time before." Morrison nodded slowly. "It's not usually that dramatic. Most of the time, I manage it pretty well.
Therapy, medication, staying aware of my triggers." He paused and took a sip of water.
"But sometimes something catches me off guard, and I'm right back there."
"Where is there?"
Sarah asked gently.
Morrison was quiet for a long moment, staring at the water bottle in his hands. When he spoke again, his voice was so low that Sarah had to lean forward to hear him clearly.
"Afghanistan.
3 years ago. We were providing overwatch for a convoy evacuation, and I had to." He stopped and shook his head.
"The details don't matter.
What matters is that I've been coming to ranges like this for months, thinking that familiar activities would help me feel normal again. But today, looking through that scope, suddenly, I wasn't shooting at paper targets anymore." Sarah felt her heart constrict as she began to understand what had happened in Lane 7. Morrison hadn't just been practicing his marksmanship, his mind had transported him back to a moment when his precision with that rifle had been a matter of life and death. The careful shot patterns she had seen on his targets weren't random practice, they were muscle memory from experiences that had left permanent marks on his psyche.
"Is that why you gave me your rifle?" she asked.
Morrison met her eyes directly for the first time since they had sat down.
"I gave you my rifle because in that moment, I wasn't sure I could trust myself with it.
And you were the only person there who seemed like someone I could trust with that responsibility." The simple honesty of his statement hit Sarah harder than she had expected. In her 22 years of life, no one had ever trusted her with anything more significant than closing the cash register or feeding a neighbor's cat while they were out of town. The idea that a complete stranger, and not just any stranger, but someone with Morrison's training and experience, had instinctively chosen her as someone worthy of that level of trust was both humbling and terrifying. "How did you know you could trust me?" she asked. Morrison smiled, and this time the expression reached his eyes.
"I've been watching you work for the past hour and a half. You pay attention to details.
You treat every customer with the same level of respect, whether they're shooting at 22 or bringing in custom equipment. You keep your workspace organized, and you follow safety protocols even when you think no one is watching." He paused. "But, mostly, when you saw that I was in trouble, your first instinct was to help rather than to call security or make a scene." Sarah hadn't realized that Morrison had been observing her so carefully while he was shooting. The idea that her routine work habits had been communicating something about her character was both surprising and oddly gratifying. She had always prided herself on doing her job well, even when it felt temporary and unimportant, but she hadn't considered that her professionalism might actually matter to the customers she served.
"What happens now?" she asked. Morrison stood up slowly, testing his stability.
The crisis had passed, but Sarah could see that he was still processing whatever memories had been triggered in Lane 7.
"Now I call my therapist and probably head home for the day. This kind of episode usually leaves me pretty drained."
He looked toward the shooting lanes. "I should probably get my equipment and apologize for cutting my session short."
"Actually," Sarah said, standing up as well, "you still have 20 minutes left on your lane reservation. And I was thinking, what if you didn't shoot alone?" Morrison raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?"
Sarah felt her heart rate increase as she voiced an idea that had been forming while they talked.
"I mean, what if I stayed in the lane with you?
I'm not a great shot, but I know the basics."
Sometimes having another person around helps keep you grounded in the present moment.
The suggestion was completely outside the boundaries of normal customer service, and Sarah was fairly certain it violated several range policies. Employees weren't supposed to socialize with customers during business hours, and they definitely weren't supposed to insert themselves into personal situations. But something about Morrison's story, and the trust he had shown in her, made the normal rules seem less important than the immediate human need in front of her. Morrison considered her offer carefully.
"You would do that? Even though you just saw me completely lose it with a loaded weapon in my hands?"
"Especially because I saw that," Sarah replied.
"You didn't lose control, Master Chief.
You recognized that you were in a dangerous mental state, and you took immediate action to ensure everyone's safety."
"That's not losing it, that's exactly what someone should do in that situation."
For the first time since she had approached him in the shooting lane, Morrison looked genuinely surprised. It was clear that he hadn't considered his actions from that perspective. Sarah realized that he had been judging himself harshly for something that had actually demonstrated remarkable self-awareness and responsibility. "Besides," she added with a slight smile, "I've been working here for 8 months, and you're the first customer who's ever treated his weapon with the level of respect it deserves. Most people come in here thinking guns are toys or symbols of power. You understand that they're tools that require discipline and mindfulness." Morrison studied her face again, and Sarah could see him weighing her words against his own self-doubt.
Finally, he nodded slowly. "If you're sure you don't mind, I think I'd like that.
But I should warn you, my shooting style is probably pretty different from what you're used to seeing here." Sarah led him back toward Lane 7, feeling a mixture of nervousness and determination. She had no idea if her instinct was correct, or if she was about to make a situation worse by inserting herself into something she didn't fully understand. But Morrison had trusted her with his weapon when he couldn't trust himself, and that trust deserved to be honored. As they approached the shooting station, Sarah retrieved Morrison's rifle from the secure storage cabinet. When she handed it back to him, she watched his face carefully for any signs of the distress she had seen earlier. Morrison accepted the weapon with steady hands and immediately checked the safety, his movements once again precise and controlled. "Thank you," he said quietly, and Sarah understood that he was thanking her for more than just returning his rifle. "Thank you for trusting me," she replied. Morrison began reassembling his shooting station, and Sarah watched as he transformed back into the focused professional she had observed when he first arrived.
But now she could see the deliberate mental discipline that went into maintaining that focus.
Every movement, every breath, every adjustment to his equipment was part of a carefully constructed framework designed to keep his mind anchored in the present moment. "Ready?" he asked, positioning himself at the shooting bench. Sarah moved to stand beside him, close enough to provide the human presence he had requested but far enough away to give him space to work. She could smell the gun oil on his hands and the faint scent of military issue soap that seemed to be permanently embedded in his clothing. As Morrison raised his rifle and began to sight in on a fresh target, Sarah realized that she was about to witness something few civilians ever saw, a Navy SEAL working through personal trauma with the same precision and dedication he had once brought to protecting others. The next 20 minutes would teach her more about courage, trust, and healing than 4 years of college psychology courses ever could. Standing beside Morrison as he prepared for his first shot since the episode, Sarah found herself holding her breath without realizing it. The atmosphere in Lane 7 had changed completely from her earlier observations. Where before Morrison had seemed isolated in his focused intensity, now there was a different quality to his concentration, one that included an awareness of her presence beside him. Morrison settled into his shooting stance with fluid grace, but Sarah noticed that he paused before placing his eye to the scope. Instead, he took 3 deliberate breaths, each one slower and more controlled than the last. On the third exhale, he finally positioned himself behind the rifle. "Range is hot," he said quietly, following proper safety protocol even though they were the only 2 people in the lane. The familiar announcement seemed to center him, connecting him to the routine and structure that had become his anchor.
The first shot surprised Sarah with its restraint.
Instead of the precision grouping she had observed earlier, Morrison aimed for the outer ring of a standard bullseye target. The report of the rifle was sharp but controlled, and she watched as he immediately lifted his head from the scope to check his surroundings, a habit that spoke of years in environments where situational awareness meant survival.
"How did that feel?" Sarah asked softly. Morrison considered the question seriously before answering. "Present," he said.
"I could feel the bench under my elbows, hear the ventilation system, smell the gun oil. All the details that anchor me here instead of somewhere else." He prepared for his second shot, and Sarah noticed that his breathing had settled into a rhythm that seemed both natural and practiced. This time, he aimed for a point slightly closer to the center of the target. The shot placement was still deliberate and controlled, but she could see that he was gradually challenging himself to increase the difficulty while maintaining his mental equilibrium.
"Can I ask you something?" Sarah said during his pause between shots.
"Of course. When you were overseas, was shooting always connected to combat situations, or did you ever get to practice just for the skill of it?" Morrison smiled slightly, and Sarah could see that the question had taken him to a different set of memories, ones that weren't traumatic.
"Actually, some of my best memories from deployment were the times when we could set up informal competitions during downtime. We'd challenge each other to increasingly difficult shots just to see who could do it.
Pure marksmanship, no life or death pressure."
"What was your favorite kind of challenge?"
Morrison positioned himself for his third shot but continued talking, and Sarah realized that the conversation was serving as another anchoring technique. "There was this game we invented where you had to call your shot before taking it. Not just where you were aiming, but exactly how you were going to hit it, what part of the trigger pull, how you were going to manage your breathing, what your follow-through would look like." He took the shot, and Sarah watched as the bullet struck exactly where he had been aiming. "Like that one," he said with satisfaction. "I called a clean break at natural respiratory pause, straight back trigger pull, and hold the sight picture through recoil." Sarah found herself genuinely fascinated by the technical precision Morrison brought to each aspect of shooting. In 8 months at the range, she had never seen anyone break down their process with such methodical awareness. Most customers were focused entirely on the outcome, where their bullet hit, but Morrison was equally invested in perfecting every component of the process that led to that outcome.
"Would you mind if I tried something?" Morrison asked, surprising her. "What do you mean?"
Morrison stepped back from the shooting bench and gestured toward his rifle.
"I'd like to see how you shoot."
"Not to judge your technique, but because sometimes teaching someone else helps me stay focused on the fundamentals." Sarah felt her pulse quicken. She had fired various weapons during her training for the job, and she practiced occasionally with the range's rental firearms, but she had never shot anything as sophisticated as Morrison's custom rifle. The weapon probably cost more than her car, and the idea of potentially damaging it or embarrassing herself in front of someone with his level of expertise was intimidating.
"I'm really not very good," she said honestly.
"I can hit a target at reasonable distances, but nothing like what you can do." Morrison smiled, and this time it was the expression of someone who had found genuine pleasure in sharing his expertise.
"Good marksmanship isn't about being naturally talented. It's about understanding the fundamentals and practicing them consistently. Everything else is just showing off."
He guided her to the shooting bench and began adjusting the rifle to accommodate her smaller frame and shorter arms. Sarah was struck by how naturally teaching seemed to come to him. His instructions were clear, patient, and focused on safety above all else. As he explained the proper sight picture and trigger control, she could see that this role, mentor and instructor, was probably how he preferred to think of his relationship with firearms. "The most important thing to remember," Morrison said as Sarah settled into position behind the rifle, "is that shooting is a conversation between you and the target.
The rifle is just the medium through which you communicate."
Sarah found his metaphor unexpectedly helpful. Instead of thinking about the mechanical aspects of firing a weapon, she could focus on the idea of sending a message to a specific point downrange. The pressure she felt to perform perfectly began to ease as she embraced the concept of communication rather than demonstration. Her first shot was respectable, not exceptional, but, well within the target area. Morrison nodded approvingly and offered a few minor adjustments to her stance and breathing. Her second shot was noticeably better, and, by the third, she was beginning to understand why Morrison found the process meditative rather than stressful. "You're a natural teacher," Sarah said as she stepped back from the rifle. "Have you ever thought about doing this professionally?" Morrison accepted the rifle back from her and secured it carefully before answering. "Actually, that's part of why I've been coming to civilian ranges. I'm transitioning out of active duty, and I'm trying to figure out what comes next. Teaching marksmanship is one option I've been considering. What are the other options?" Morrison was quiet for a moment, and Sarah could see him weighing how much of his uncertainty he wanted to share. "That's the problem," he said finally. "Most of my skills are pretty specialized. I'm good at things that don't translate easily to civilian life." Sarah realized that Morrison was facing a challenge that probably confronted many veterans: how to find purpose and identity in a world that didn't require the specific abilities that had defined their military service. His expertise with firearms was undeniable, but the context in which he had developed that expertise was something he was trying to move away from. "What did you enjoy most about your military service?" she asked. "Besides the actual combat missions, I mean." Morrison considered the question while he adjusted his equipment for another series of shots. "Training new team members," he said without hesitation. "Taking someone who had potential and helping them develop the skills and confidence they needed to excel. Knowing that what I taught them might save their life or the lives of their teammates." Sarah could see the animation in his face as he talked about teaching and mentoring. This was clearly where his passion lay, not in the weapons themselves but in the opportunity to share knowledge and help others grow. The rifle in his hands was just a tool for that larger purpose. "Have you looked into instructor positions at training academies or law enforcement programs?" she asked. Morrison shook his head. "I've been worried that I'm too unstable to be responsible for training others. What happened earlier, when I handed you my rifle, that's not the first time I've had an episode like that." Sarah felt a flash of frustration on Morrison's behalf. "Master Chief, you had a psychological response to trauma, recognized that you were experiencing it, and took immediate action to ensure everyone's safety. That's not instability, that's exactly the kind of self-awareness and responsibility you'd want in an instructor." Morrison looked at her with surprise, and Sarah realized that he had been judging his PTSD symptoms as a character flaw rather than as a normal response to extraordinary circumstances. The same high standards that had made him an excellent Navy SEAL were now working against him as he tried to build a civilian life. "Besides," Sarah continued, "you just spent 20 minutes helping me improve my shooting more than I had in 8 months of working here. You're patient, clear, and you focus on safety first. Those are exactly the qualities that make a good teacher." Morrison took his final shot of the session, and Sarah watched as the bullet struck the exact center of the target. But, instead of the isolated satisfaction she had observed earlier, this shot seemed to carry a different meaning, not an endpoint, but a demonstration of possibilities. As Morrison began disassembling his rifle and packing his equipment, Sarah could see that something had shifted in his demeanor. The confidence he displayed in his shooting had begun to extend to his thinking about his future. The conversation about teaching had clearly resonated with him in a way that went beyond polite interest. "Sarah," he said as he closed his rifle case, "would you mind if I asked you a question?" "Of course." Morrison seemed to be choosing his words carefully. "If you were looking for a firearms instructor, whether for personal training or professional development, what would be most important to you in that person?" Sarah realized that Morrison was testing an idea, using her response to gauge whether his interest in teaching might actually translate into a viable career path. She thought carefully before answering, wanting to give him honest feedback that might help him make an important decision about his future. "I'd want someone who understood that every student has different goals and different comfort levels," she said. "Someone who could adapt their teaching style to what I needed to learn, rather than just teaching the way they learned. And, most importantly, someone who treated firearms with the respect they deserve, but didn't make me feel stupid for not knowing everything already." Morrison nodded slowly, and Sarah could see that her answer had given him something useful to consider. As they walked together toward the exit of the shooting lanes, she realized that their afternoon had been transformative for both of them in ways she was still processing. "Thank you," Morrison said as they reached the main counter. "For everything. I came here today thinking I was just maintaining a skill, and I'm leaving with a much clearer idea of what I want to do with the rest of my life." Sarah smiled, feeling a sense of accomplishment that had nothing to do with target scores or job performance.
Thank you for trusting me with something important when it mattered.
As Morrison headed toward the exit, rifle case in hand, Sarah realized that she had learned something crucial about the difference between helping people and truly serving them. The distinction would change how she approached not just her work, but every interaction that followed. 3 weeks after Morrison's visit, Sarah found herself thinking about their conversation every time she reset targets in Lane 7. The interaction had left her with a strange sense of unfinished business, not because anything had been left unsaid, but because she couldn't shake the feeling that something significant had begun that Tuesday afternoon, something that extended beyond their brief encounter. The immediate changes in her daily routine were small but noticeable. She paid more attention to the customers who seemed hesitant or uncertain, offering brief words of encouragement or technical advice when appropriate. She began to recognize the subtle signs of veterans among her customers, the particular way they handled their weapons, their unconscious scanning of exits and sightlines, and sometimes the distant look in their eyes that suggested they were seeing something other than paper targets downrange. Detective Rodriguez had commented on her increased attentiveness. "You've gotten good at reading people," he had said after she successfully helped him diagnose a problem with his service weapons sight alignment.
That's not something they teach in customer service training.
Sarah had smiled and shrugged off the compliment, but privately she knew exactly where she had learned to pay attention to what people weren't saying. Morrison had shown her that sometimes the most important part of helping someone had nothing to do with the official reason they had come seeking assistance. On a Thursday morning exactly 3 weeks after Morrison's visit, Sarah was organizing inventory in the storage room when her coworker Marcus knocked on the doorframe. Marcus handled most of the administrative duties at the range and rarely got involved with customer interactions unless there was a problem that required management intervention. "Hey, Sarah, there's someone here asking for you specifically," Marcus said, looking puzzled. "Military guy, says you helped him with some equipment issues a few weeks ago. He's got someone with him who's interested in private instruction." Sarah felt her heart rate increase as she followed Marcus to the front counter. She found Morrison waiting with a woman in her 40s who carried herself with the confident posture of law enforcement. Both of them turned as she approached, and Sarah was relieved to see that Morrison looked substantially more relaxed than he had during their last encounter. "Sarah, I'd like you to meet Detective Lisa Campbell from the County Sheriff's Department," Morrison said with a smile. "Lisa, this is the range employee I was telling you about." Detective Campbell extended her hand with a firm grip. "James tells me you're the person to talk to about practical firearms instruction for law enforcement applications." Sarah glanced at Morrison with surprise. She had never provided law enforcement training and had certainly never presented herself as qualified to do so. Morrison caught her confused expression and gave her a slight nod that seemed to say, "Trust me on this." "Detective Campbell is looking for supplemental training beyond the standard department qualifications," Morrison explained. "She's particularly interested in developing better situational awareness and stress management techniques for high-pressure shooting scenarios." Sarah began to understand what was happening. Morrison had clearly been thinking about their conversation regarding his potential career as an instructor, and he had identified Detective Campbell as someone who might benefit from the kind of teaching approach they had discussed. But, instead of positioning himself as the instructor, he was somehow involving Sarah in the process. "I appreciate James's recommendation," Detective Campbell said, "but I should be honest about what I'm looking for. I've been in law enforcement for 18 years, and I'm solid on the fundamentals of marksmanship. What I need help with is maintaining accuracy and decision-making when everything goes sideways. James mentioned that you have insights into the psychological aspects of shooting under stress." Sarah felt completely out of her depth. While her psychology coursework had covered stress responses and decision-making under pressure, she had never applied any of that knowledge to firearms training. She was about to explain her lack of qualifications when Morrison spoke up again. "Sarah, could you tell Detective Campbell about your observation regarding the difference between communication and demonstration when it comes to marksmanship?" Sarah realized that Morrison was referring to the metaphor he had shared with her about shooting being a conversation with the target. As she explained the concept to Detective Campbell, she found herself naturally expanding on the idea, drawing connections between effective communication principles and maintaining focus under pressure. "The interesting thing about thinking of shooting as communication," Sarah said, warming to the topic, "is that good communication requires you to be fully present in the moment. You have to be aware of your audience, clear about your message, and conscious of how external factors might interfere with the transmission of that message." Detective Campbell nodded thoughtfully.
That's actually a really useful way to think about it.
Most of my training has focused on the mechanical aspects, stance, sight alignment, trigger control.
But, you're talking about the mental framework that supports those mechanics.
Morrison smiled at Sarah's explanation, and she could see that he was pleased with how naturally she had taken to discussing the psychological aspects of marksmanship. Sarah also has excellent observational skills when it comes to reading stress indicators and helping people stay grounded during challenging situations, he added. Sarah began to understand the larger picture of what Morrison was proposing. He wasn't just recommending her as an instructor, he was suggesting a collaborative approach that combined his technical expertise with her developing insights into the psychological aspects of performance under stress.
What would something like that look like practically? Detective Campbell asked.
Before Sarah could protest that she wasn't qualified to design training programs, Morrison answered. We were thinking about a series of workshops that would combine traditional marksmanship instruction with practical exercises in stress management and situational awareness. Sarah would handle the psychological preparation and mental training aspects, while I would cover the technical instruction and scenario-based practice.
The pronoun we caught Sarah's attention immediately.
Morrison was proposing a partnership that assumed she was already committed to becoming involved in firearms instruction. The presumption should have annoyed her, but instead she found herself genuinely intrigued by the possibility.
Have either of you done anything like this before? Detective Campbell asked. Morrison shook his head. This would be a new venture for both of us.
But Sarah has been observing student behavior and instructor techniques here at the range for months, and she's currently studying psychology with a focus on stress responses and decision-making. I have the military training background and technical expertise. Between us, we think we could offer something that addresses both the physical and mental aspects of shooting performance. Sarah realized that Morrison had been thinking about their conversation much more seriously than she had assumed. He hadn't just been making casual conversation about potential career changes, he had been developing a concrete plan that incorporated the insights they had shared during his visit to the range. I'm interested, Detective Campbell said.
When could we set up a trial session?
Morrison looked at Sarah expectantly, and she realized that she was being asked to make a decision that could significantly alter the direction of her life. The comfortable predictability of her current routine, counting days until she could afford to return to college, viewing her job as a temporary necessity rather than a potential career path, was being challenged by an opportunity she had never considered. I'd need to check with my supervisor about scheduling, Sarah said carefully, and I'd want to be very clear about my current level of expertise before we commit to anything. Of course, Morrison replied. But, Sarah, I want you to know that what I observed during our time together wasn't beginner's luck. You have natural instincts for reading people and creating supportive learning environments.
Those skills can be developed and applied professionally.
As Detective Campbell exchanged contact information with both Sarah and Morrison, Sarah found herself mentally reviewing the conversation from 3 weeks earlier. Morrison's crisis in Lane 7 had led to a discussion about teaching that had apparently planted the seeds for a potential business partnership. What had felt like an isolated moment of human connection was revealing itself to be the beginning of something larger. After Detective Campbell left, Morrison remained at the counter. I hope you don't mind that I used your name when I was describing the concept to her, he said. But our conversation really did give me a new perspective on how firearms instruction could be approached differently. Sarah leaned against the counter, trying to process the rapid shift from her ordinary Thursday morning routine to a conversation about professional collaboration.
James, I need to be honest with you.
I don't have any formal training in instruction, and my psychology background is still pretty basic.
What if I'm not actually qualified to do what you're describing? Morrison smiled.
Sarah, 3 weeks ago I handed you my rifle because I trusted your judgment in a moment when I couldn't trust my own. You helped me work through a psychological crisis and encouraged me to think about my future differently. If you can do that with no formal training, imagine what you could accomplish if you decided to develop those skills intentionally. The parallel Morrison drew between her instinctive response to his crisis and the potential for professional development was compelling, but Sarah still felt overwhelmed by the scope of what he was suggesting. This would be a huge change from what I'm doing now, she said. It would be a huge change for me too, Morrison replied. But sometimes the best opportunities come from unexpected directions. I didn't plan to have a PTSD episode in Lane 7, and you didn't plan to help me work through it. But what came out of that experience was something valuable for both of us.
Sarah looked around the familiar environment of the shooting range, considering how different her life might look if she pursued Morrison's proposal. The steady routine that had sustained her for 8 months would be replaced by the uncertainty and challenge of building something new.
But it would also mean moving from a job that she viewed as temporary to work that could potentially become a meaningful career. What would be the first step, she asked.
Morrison's face lit up with enthusiasm.
The first step would be for us to design and deliver the trial session for Detective Campbell. If it goes well, we could use it as a foundation for developing a more comprehensive program. Sarah felt a familiar flutter of anxiety mixed with excitement, the same feeling she had experienced when she first decided to leave home for college, or when she had chosen to approach Morrison in Lane 7 despite having no idea how to help him. It was the sensation of standing at the edge of something unknown but potentially transformative. "Okay," she said, surprising herself with the firmness in her voice. "Let's try it." Morrison extended his hand, and, as Sarah shook it, she realized that she was agreeing to much more than a single training session. She was committing to discovering whether the instincts and observations that had served her well in crisis could be developed into genuine expertise. The question was no longer whether she was qualified to teach firearms instruction, it was whether she was willing to become qualified. Looking at Morrison's confident smile, Sarah understood that he had probably known her answer before she had asked the question. The trust he had shown in her 3 weeks ago hadn't been a moment of desperation, it had been an investment in potential he had recognized before she had seen it in herself. 6 months later, Sarah stood in what used to be Lane 7, watching Detective Campbell demonstrate proper breathing techniques to a group of new recruits from 3 different law enforcement agencies. The shooting range looked exactly the same as it had the morning Morrison first walked in, but everything about Sarah's relationship to this space had been transformed. The trial session with Detective Campbell had exceeded everyone's expectations. Morrison's technical instruction combined with Sarah's focus on psychological preparation had created a learning environment that was both challenging and supportive. Campbell's accuracy under stress had improved dramatically, but, more importantly, she had developed a framework for maintaining mental clarity during high-pressure situations that extended beyond firearms training into other aspects of her police work. Word had spread quickly through the law enforcement community. Within 2 months, Sarah and Morrison were conducting regular workshops for police departments, sheriff's offices, and federal agencies throughout the region. The demand had grown so rapidly that Sarah had been able to quit her position at Precision Point and transition to full-time collaboration with Morrison's newly established training company. The business had evolved far beyond what either of them had initially envisioned. While firearms instruction remained the foundation of their work, they had developed programs addressing stress management, decision-making under pressure, and team communication that were being requested by organizations that had nothing to do with weapons training. Sarah's psychology coursework, which had once seemed like a distant academic pursuit, had become the theoretical foundation for practical applications she was discovering every day. Morrison had transformed as well. The confident instructor who worked with their clients bore little resemblance to the man who had struggled with dissociation in Lane 7 6 months earlier. His PTSD symptoms hadn't disappeared, but he had learned to manage them as part of his professional expertise rather than despite it. The vulnerability he had shown Sarah that first day had become a strength that made him more effective with students who were dealing with their own trauma and stress responses. Today's session was special because it marked the completion of their first comprehensive instructor certification program. The 12 participants included not just law enforcement officers, but military veterans, private security professionals, and civilian firearms instructors who wanted to incorporate psychological training into their own programs. Sarah was watching the culmination of 6 months of program development, testing, and refinement. Detective Campbell, who had become something of an unofficial spokesperson for their training methods, was demonstrating the communication metaphor that had originated from Morrison's teaching during Sarah's first shooting lesson. Watching Campbell explain to others how to think of marksmanship as a conversation with the target gave Sarah a profound sense of how ideas could evolve and spread through communities of practice. Morrison approached Sarah during a break between exercises. "Hard to believe it's only been 6 months, he said, echoing her own thoughts. "Sometimes it feels like 6 years, Sarah replied. "I can barely remember what it was like to think of this place as just somewhere I worked while I saved money for college." Morrison smiled. "Any regrets about postponing your return to school?" Sarah had wrestled with that question repeatedly over the past months. The financial stability of her partnership with Morrison had eliminated the immediate pressure to return to college, but it had also required her to reconsider what she actually wanted to achieve through higher education. I'm learning more about psychology and human behavior every week than I did in 2 years of coursework, she said.
And I'm applying it immediately instead of just memorizing it for tests. But, you're still thinking about going back eventually? Sarah nodded. Differently than before, though. I used to think of college as an escape from work I didn't find meaningful. Now I'm thinking about graduate programs that could enhance what I'm already doing.
The conversation was interrupted by a commotion near the equipment storage area. One of the program participants, a veteran named Rodriguez who had been struggling with some of the stress management exercises, was standing motionless with his training weapon lowered, his breathing rapid and shallow. Sarah recognized the signs immediately. Rodriguez was experiencing something very similar to what Morrison had gone through 6 months earlier. Without conscious thought, Sarah moved toward Rodriguez while Morrison began quietly directing the other participants to continue their exercises in a different section of the range. The coordination between them was automatic now, developed through months of working together in situations that required immediate adaptation to unexpected challenges. Rodriguez, Sarah said softly, positioning herself where he could see her clearly without feeling cornered.
You're at the training facility. It's Thursday afternoon. You're safe.
Rodriguez's eyes focused on her gradually, and Sarah could see him fighting to orient himself in present reality rather than whatever memory had been triggered by the exercise. His hands were trembling slightly, but he maintained his grip on the training weapon with proper safety discipline. I'm having one of those episodes, Rodriguez said quietly, his voice tight with embarrassment and frustration. You're having a normal response to extraordinary experiences, Sarah replied, using language she had developed through months of working with veterans and first responders. And you're managing it exactly the way you should. You stopped the exercise when you recognized what was happening. Morrison appeared beside them, moving with the same calm confidence Sarah remembered from their first encounter.
Rodriguez, would you like to hand off your weapon and step away for a few minutes?
Rodriguez nodded and carefully transferred his training rifle to Morrison, then followed Sarah to the same rest area where she and Morrison had talked 6 months earlier. As they sat down, Sarah was struck by how natural this process had become for her. What had once seemed like an unprecedented crisis now felt like a standard part of helping people work through the intersection of technical training and psychological healing.
How often does this happen?
Rodriguez asked, still working to control his breathing.
More often than you might think, Sarah replied. And it's not a sign of weakness or failure. It's evidence that your nervous system is working exactly the way it's designed to work when it encounters reminders of dangerous situations. Sarah spent the next 15 minutes with Rodriguez, using breathing exercises and grounding techniques that had become second nature through repetition and practice. When they returned to the training area, the other participants welcomed Rodriguez back without comment or judgment, a response that spoke to the culture Morrison and Sarah had worked to create in their programs. As the day's session concluded, Sarah found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought her to this moment. 6 months ago, she had been a range employee counting days until she could afford to pursue a different life. Today, she was a professional instructor helping law enforcement and military personnel develop skills that could save their lives and the lives of others. The transformation hadn't been without challenges. Learning to design curriculum, handle business logistics, and manage the emotional intensity of working with trauma survivors had required Sarah to develop capabilities she hadn't known she possessed. But each challenge had also revealed strengths and interests that had been dormant during her years of viewing her work as temporary and unimportant. Detective Campbell approached as Sarah was packing up her materials. I wanted to thank you both again, Campbell said. Not just for the training, but for changing how I think about the work we do.
The techniques I've learned here have affected every aspect of my job, not just the firearms components.
That's been the best part of this whole experience, Sarah replied.
Discovering that the principles we teach here, presence, communication, stress management, trust, are really universal tools for handling challenging situations. After the participants had left, Sarah and Morrison began the familiar routine of securing equipment and resetting the training area for the next day's session. The work was similar to what Sarah had done during her months as a range employee, but the context had changed everything about how the routine felt to her. Sarah, Morrison said as they finished their cleanup, I've been thinking about something, and I wanted to run it past you. Sarah looked up from the target frames she was organizing.
What's on your mind?
Morrison seemed to be choosing his words carefully. We've had inquiries from several organizations about developing programs for people who aren't in law enforcement or military roles. civilians who want training in stress management and decision-making, but in contexts that don't involve firearms. Sarah felt her interest sharpen immediately. The prospect of applying their methods to broader populations had occurred to her many times, but she hadn't been sure Morrison would be interested in moving beyond their current focus. What kinds of organizations? She asked. Medical professionals dealing with emergency situations, teachers working in high-stress educational environments, business executives who need to make critical decisions under pressure.
Morrison paused.
The common thread is people who need to maintain peak performance when everything around them is chaotic. Sarah realized that Morrison was describing a natural evolution of their work that could eventually reach far beyond the specialized communities they currently served. The techniques they had developed for helping people stay grounded and focused during firearms training could be adapted for almost any high-pressure professional environment.
That sounds like it could become something really significant, she said. Morrison nodded.
It could also mean expanding the business beyond what either of us originally envisioned.
Are you interested in exploring that direction?
Sarah looked around the shooting range that had been the starting point for her unexpected career transformation. 6 months ago, Morrison had trusted her with his weapon during a moment of crisis.
That trust had led to a partnership that was now expanding into territory neither of them had anticipated.
I'm interested, she said. But I think I'm also ready to start working on that graduate degree we talked about earlier. If we're going to develop programs for diverse professional populations, I want to make sure I have the theoretical foundation to do it responsibly.
Morrison's face lit up with enthusiasm. That's exactly the kind of thinking that convinced me you were the right partner for this venture. How would you feel about pursuing a graduate program that could complement and enhance what we're building here?
As they walked toward the exit of the shooting range, Sarah realized that she was no longer making decisions about her future based on escape from unsatisfying work, but rather on the expansion of work that had become genuinely meaningful. The question wasn't whether she could afford to go back to school, but how she could integrate further education with a career that was already exceeding her expectations.
James, she said as they reached the parking lot, can I ask you something?
Of course. Sarah looked back at the building that housed Precision Point Range, thinking about the morning 6 months ago when Morrison had first walked through those doors.
When you handed me your rifle that day, did you have any idea that it would lead to all this? Morrison considered the question seriously.
No, he said finally. But I knew that you were someone who could be trusted with something important.
Everything else grew from that foundation.
As Sarah drove home that evening, she found herself thinking about the unpredictability of trust and opportunity. 6 months ago, she had been a young woman with modest goals and limited expectations. Today, she was a business partner, instructor, and emerging expert in applied psychology who was planning graduate studies that would enable her to serve populations she had never considered. The transformation had begun with a simple decision to approach someone who needed help, despite having no idea what kind of help to offer. That willingness to engage with uncertainty and vulnerability had opened doors Sarah hadn't even known existed. Looking ahead to the challenges and opportunities that awaited her, Sarah understood that the most important lesson from her experience with Morrison wasn't about firearms, business development, or stress management. It was about the exponential power of showing up authentically in moments when other people needed someone to trust. The ripple effects of those moments could extend far beyond anything she had imagined possible when she was simply resetting targets and counting days until she could afford a different life. The story that had begun with brass casings hitting concrete and a Navy SEAL in crisis had become something much larger, a testament to the transformative potential of human connection and the unexpected directions life could take when people chose to trust each other with their vulnerabilities and possibilities.